Welcome back to the Torque Test channel and our first ever video on ratchets. DeWalt has just come out with their first ever cordless ratchets, if you don't count Mac tools. The first example is being from this 12 volt extreme line. But it's hard to know just how good a cordless ratchet is without comparing it to the competition. So today we're going to take a crack at that versus the M12 line, which consists of their higher torque ratchet and their newest high-speed ratchet. This is Milwaukee's 2560-20 ratchet extended length because the DeWalt we've had on order for over 3 months was extended length as well, and we wanted to compare them. But our orders have been pushed out repeatedly, so here's DeWalt's DCF503B standard length, courtesy of YouTuber and our friend Joe the Tool Guy. Check him out, his letter to us pretty much says everything you need to know about Joe. But this new DeWalt compares most closely to that larger M12 ratchet because both of these are high-ish torque ratchets. The new DeWalt being rated for 60 foot-pounds and the Milwaukee 55 foot-pounds. The second M12 we're showing is their newest model, their high-speed ratchet, which is a lower 35 foot-pounds but a higher 450 RPM compared to the 200 of the M12 and 250 RPM of the DeWalt. The DeWalt's 2 amp hour battery actually fits on this tool pretty well. I was expecting something a little bit more unsightly when I first saw images of this tool with the battery hanging off. The Milwaukee's 2 amp hour pack though obviously integrating into the tool even better. Though the push button throttle on the DeWalt is welcome, none of us here really like the paddle throttle lever on Milwaukee's all that much. They sort of get annoying after some use. Also, the forward reverse selector on the DeWalt is much easier to use and actually possible with gloves, unlike Milwaukee's, which has this smaller and shallower knob that even on the much larger head higher torque M12 uses that same design. Speaking of large heads, the DeWalt has one, similar in size to the larger Milwaukee, a touch narrower but also thicker too, due in part to that more convenient selector switch. When comparing versus the 2566-20 high-speed, it's not even close. The M12 is much smaller and more similar to the OG cordless ratchets of old, hand ratchets, since they never had cords to begin with. What's not small is DeWalt's largest 12 amp hour pack, their 5 amp hour, which sticks off this tool in a chunky, not so awesome way. So we'll have to see how that affects torque and if that's well worth it. And on the topic of torque, specifically for ratchets, it doesn't mean a whole lot, maybe 25% of the pie, in my opinion. Yes, you heard that right. On the Torque Test channel, torque is not super important on these tools. But if you're here for the torque figures and torque alone, we do have the goods. You can go to the timestamp shown here to skip testing of these tools to actually reflect how they're used. But from what we've learned already, we can visit the rank chart now. They're ranked here in no particular order. Points on this list are bad, as in you don't want points here. Their average weight is here. That's how much the tool weighs with a battery across all the batteries we've used, averaged. That's 3.1 pounds, so 31 points for the standard length version of this higher torque M12, since it shouldn't get penalized for us buying the longer version today. 24 points for the high speed, and 30 points, so worse, for the DeWalt, which also feels pretty front heavy with a normal battery on it. Their head dimensions are here, sort of a cross-sectional area function here. 34 points, 17, and 37 for the DeWalt due to being a bit thicker. Then price. Man, cordless ratchets are pricey. This is still for standard length, but the extended M12 we bought was $229. An extended DeWalt is just $10 more than this one shown here. So that's 34, 36, and 36 points, pretty close. But you might have noticed we have a Gauntlet time section over here. Well, that's what we wanted to make, a testing gauntlet for ratchets. While RPM is important, if that RPM bogs down during use, who's really going to be on top? It's hard to say from the specs alone. So we drilled and tapped this angle iron for 5 different sizes, 3 bolts per size from 1/4 inch to 1/2 inch threads, which looks like this. Then what these tools will be working on are nylon lock nuts. Free speed is cool, but what happens when that bolt or stud is rusty, cruddy, or just imperfect threads? These nylon lock nuts represent a constant load on the tool that increases with bolt size, from just about 4 foot-pounds on small bolts to 15 foot-pounds, the entire length of the bolt on the largest. That way you know the RPM is not just BS marketing speak, but a useful RPM that doesn't bog down from imperfections. Here's an example on just a regular nut. Versus a lock nut. So quite a difference, but a higher torque ratchet should be less affected by that, evening the playing field for real life use. And we have over 1,000 new grade 5 and grade 8 bolts and nuts to replace after each test to keep things constant for today's video and future ones. Tools will be shown only while in use, cutting out the setup time up versus both higher torque models from M12 and DeWalt using their best batteries. Because these testing runs are long enough, I'm going to be talking over this at times. Originally wanted to add some type of moving bar graph on screen because it's sort of what we do here, but this head-to-head from right to left on your screen is already pretty indicative of their pace. You'll notice the 250 RPM of the DeWalt making some early gains already over the 200 RPM M12. But torque is required to do well in this test. Nearly half the bolts on this Gauntlet need to be loosened at increasing levels of torque at the foot-pound values you see below. If the tool can't loosen it with the trigger, you have to work it by hand just like you would working on a car. If a tool never has to be used by hand because it's powerful enough, it's going to get stuff done quicker without that hand use and benefit from that, also like in real life. So it's clear that the DeWalt here is moving out ahead, and even once it hits some of the tougher tightened bolts, it's able to make mostly quick work of them. Keep in mind, during just free spinning, these tools are seeing 5 to 15 foot-pounds of work constantly from those new nylon locking nuts. So the DeWalt ultimately finishes at 2 minutes and 6 seconds, right as the M12 is struggling with the 35 foot-pound nut, a nut that DeWalt was able to take off with just a trigger pull. The Milwaukee eventually finishes at 3 minutes and 10 seconds, just over a minute after. And this is not just a function of RPM. If the M12 is 200 RPM and the DeWalt's 250, the DeWalt should be finishing 25% faster by RPM alone, but it was closer to 50% faster while under load in this test. But the hurdles for the DeWalt are just beginning. Now for the M12 high speed, which should be bringing a lot more ripums at 450 RPM. That is if it isn't bogged down by the later larger bolts in this test. The newest M12 ratchet speed is blistering. It should be no surprise to you if you're familiar with cordless ratchets why speed is an advantage. Sure, the M12 has to pause like here on the 20 foot-pound bolt to work it by hand first because it's bringing less torque, but that's how most of these things go. A ratchet is not an impact tool. If you're using one of these to loosen a bolt and solely expecting that to happen by pulling the trigger each time, you're going to be having a hard time in life. These are nut runners. They should have enough power to overcome nicked and rusty threads, but otherwise just spin stuff off quickly. Both of these tools do that well, the DeWalt having to stop less often to work by hand, which is why it's catching up towards the end here. And like on this 50 foot-pound nut, the M12 is going to have to take more hand ratcheting than normal before that throttle works. But at the end of the day, even under new nylock nut loads, the M12 is able to do the task quicker, finishing at 1 minute and 40 seconds. The DeWalt not far behind though at its 2 minutes and 6 seconds. Which means on our ranking in seconds, these models get 190, 100, and 126 for the time it took each of these to complete the Gauntlet. Last up, and per our namesake here, we have torque testing. These will be the only figures that award negative points, which are a benefit here. The higher their torque, the more points they get to shave off of their tally. One of the cool things about the DeWalt is it technically has interchangeable heads. You could theoretically buy the extended version or that head alone and swap it onto here. We thought taking these bolts out would do the trick, but no, it's turning this head entirely. This looks like a collar nut, but you have to spin the whole head like 1.5 inch threads with Loctite to take it off. A real BITCH with a wrench. But the upside, I guess, is you could make a cool right angle head or some other weird angles to your preference. Now we're coming up on that timestamp we mentioned at the beginning of this video for torque addicted folks, so this is just for a bit of fun for confusion's sake. Geez, that's like the 4th time this thing has come apart. Unbelievable. Oh well, let's put it back together yet again and head to the torque dyno. This will be torque compared to a torque wrench since there's no real testing standard for power ratchets that we know of. Here's the higher torque M12 ratchet with a 2 amp hour battery. Yep, a whole 1 second of action there, and 45 foot-pounds. And another 45, which could be persuaded up to about 54 foot-pounds. Now here's the same ratchet with an XC 6.0 battery. About 60 foot-pounds, and that can be convinced up to 70 foot-pounds. Using these tools by hand is pretty important as they aren't powerhouses, so let's just try to break it that way. Obviously this is helping us with this extended length for extra leverage, but 235 foot-pounds. I think that should cover most things in 3/8. And now here's for the DeWalt with a 2 amp hour battery. $67, but couldn't be convinced higher than that. And with the 5 amp hour battery as much as 72 from our attempts, additional pulls of the trigger don't seem to help this tool much. Right now we just give it the beans by hand, basically as much grunt as you could be expected to produce with this length, and then we're going to check its progress. $217. Yeah, these tools are pretty up there with just normal ratchets alone. That's a lot of torque. Lastly, the M12 high-speed 2566 with a 6 amp hour. And that's as good as we saw, 29. The other two ratchets went over their ratings of 55 and 60. This high-speed just shy of its 35. And we were able to get this model up to 170 foot-pounds by hand, but Test was standing in front of the camera. Probably a length limitation more than anything else, but no damage. On the rank chart, we can finally tally these scores now with 70, 29, and 72 foot-pounds in the form of points able to be taken off of their scores to help them rank higher. That totals 219, pretty high, 148, and 157. Putting overall, even with 29 foot-pounds, the M12 high-speed in first. Then the DeWalt following pretty closely behind, and the M12 2557 last, so far. The performance and specs of the extended and standard length models on this one should be the same. Personally, this is where I'd rank them as well. The DeWalt is good, very good even, and if you own DeWalt batteries, you should be pretty happy this thing came along. But the speed of this ratchet, even under moderate load, you have to use it by hand more often, its speed seems to more than make up for it. You'll notice the 70 points here are near 25% of the total of scoring from all the points, which is how we feel this category sits in real life. Peak torque, or the ability of the tool to shove your knuckles into part of the engine, is about 25% of the pie by itself. Not that brands sell tools this way, torque figures are always going to sell a tool better. Sometimes companies might make a lure that's better at catching fish, and sometimes they make a lure that's better at catching fishermen, if you know what I mean. This DeWalt, though, advertised higher torque than the 55 foot-pound M12, and more or less, yeah, I got there. Advertised higher RPM than that too, which is difficult feat to pull off both, and it did that as well. And under load. Gotta be pretty happy with that. I'm suspicious of their 20-volt versions being much better than this, but with power stack being an only 20-volt option, it might be an attractive little package. Suggest more ratchets below so we can really see if this Milwaukee model deserves being on the bottom. Click thumbs up to see those, and thanks for watching.